3rd of November, 1942. In the Egyptian desert, Erwin Rommel was watching his army come apart. The British pressure had become relentless. Tanks were disappearing. Ammunition was running down. Fuel was desperately scarce. Infantry formations had been mauled, and Adolf Hitler had demanded that the Axis army hold its ground rather than retreat. Rommel described the situation in brutally simple terms. "We're being crushed by the enemy weight." But that sentence raises a strange question. When a great commander loses, where does he put the reason? Imagine a ledger lying open on a field desk. Why Rommel lost? Supply, numbers, fuel, air power, orders from above, and one final column, Montgomery. By the end of this story, almost every column will have something written inside it. But for a surprisingly long time, one of them will remain empty. If you enjoy military history where the legend is tested against what actually happened, like the video and subscribe. Because El Alamein becomes much more interesting when neither Rommel nor Montgomery is reduced to a caricature. The first entry in the ledger is almost impossible to dispute. Supply. North Africa punished every army that advanced too far. The further forces moved from their ports and depots, the more fuel had to be burned simply to bring fuel forward. Vehicles broke down. Spare parts traveled hundreds of miles. Ammunition, food, and water competed for transport. Both sides suffered from this problem during the Desert War. But by late 1942, the Axis position had become critical. British air and naval power was interfering with the Mediterranean supply system, while Rommel's army sat at the far end of a brutally extended logistical chain. Rommel later placed enormous emphasis on precisely this point, so the first column can be filled honestly. Supply, yes. And already Montgomery's victory becomes slightly less mysterious. Perhaps Britain did not need a brilliant commander. Perhaps it simply needed to wait until Rommel's logistics strangled him. Except there is a problem. Rommel had faced shortages before, and Britain had failed to destroy him before. At Gazala, he had beaten British forces and captured Tobruk. Earlier, British commanders had discovered that possessing resources and turning them into a coherent battlefield victory were not necessarily the same thing. So another column opens. Numbers. At the Second Battle of El Alamein, Montgomery commanded more than 190,000 men and over 1,000 tanks. Rommel commanded roughly 116,000 German and Italian troops with about 540 tanks. The British advantage also extended to artillery, anti-tank weapons, and aircraft. Numbers, yes. Now ask the uncomfortable question. How much skill does it take to win when you have more? Do not answer it yet, because the third column is even more damaging to Montgomery's legend. Fuel. A tank without fuel is not really a mobile weapon, and mobility had been one of Rommel's greatest strengths. His victories in the desert had repeatedly depended upon speed, rapid concentration, maneuver, and the ability to move armored formations faster than his opponent could react. But at Alam Halfa in late August and early September, fuel shortages helped cripple his final attempt to break through the British position. Rommel's own account describes armored units nearing exhaustion, promised petrol failing to arrive, heavy British air attacks, and, finally, the decision to abandon the offensive because the supply situation had become disastrous. Fuel, yes. Now the ledger looks brutal. Supply, numbers, fuel. Perhaps Rommel did not lose to Montgomery at all. Perhaps he lost to arithmetic. And then the camera pulls farther back, because El Alamein was not taking place inside a sealed box containing two famous generals. The Royal Navy, Allied shipping, Mediterranean interdiction, the Desert Air Force, factories thousands of miles away, American equipment, and a vast Allied logistical structure were all shaping what could happen on that strip of Egyptian desert. Rommel understood the importance of air power especially well. His receptive account argued that Allied air superiority restricted movement, attacked supply traffic, and made the mobile style of warfare he preferred increasingly difficult. Air power, yes. Material superiority, yes. Strategic positions, yes. Return to the ledger now. Almost everything has an explanation, and Montgomery's column is still blank. Is that actually unfair? Montgomery did not build Britain's factories. He did not manufacture the Sherman tanks. He did not create the Royal Navy. He did not personally sink Axis supply ships. He did not create Rommel's fuel shortage. He did not invent the enormous economic imbalance that was beginning to tilt the wider war against the Axis. So what exactly are we giving Montgomery credit for? Twos. Perhaps that is the wrong question. A commander does not have to create an advantage to deserve credit for using it. The more useful questions are different. Did he understand the advantage? Did he preserve it? Did he avoid throwing it away? And most importantly, could he force the enemy to fight the kind of battle in which that advantage would matter most? We've reached halfway, so if you're enjoying this breakdown, like the video, subscribe, and tell me in the comments, when judging a commander, how much should material superiority reduce the credit for victory? Because now, Montgomery's empty column finally begins to change. When Montgomery took command of the 8th Army in August 1942, there was enormous pressure to produce results. Instead, he prepared. He trained the army. He worked on morale. He reorganized. He accumulated ammunition and equipment. And after Alamein, he did something that can look almost unimpressive when written on a map. He did not rush. The National Army Museum notes that Montgomery resisted pressure from Winston Churchill for an earlier offensive and continued building up his forces before attacking. That matters because the criticism of Montgomery has always contained an awkward truth. Yes, he wanted overwhelming strength. Yes, he was cautious. Yes, he preferred calculation to improvisation. But what if that was partly the point? Rommel needed mobility. Rommel needed space. Rommel needed opportunities to make his opponent overextend, separate formations, and react badly. Montgomery did not need to prove that he could beat Rommel at Rommel's favorite game. He needed to win the campaign. At El Alamein, the geography already restricted maneuver. The Mediterranean stood to the north. The Qattara Depression blocked large-scale mechanized movement to the south. Rommel, therefore, constructed deep defensive positions and minefields because shortages of fuel and mechanized strength made a mobile defense increasingly difficult. Now consider the battle each commander could afford. Rommel wanted room, movement, rapid concentration, a chance to turn the enemy flank, a chance to make a British formation expose itself and then punish it. Montgomery wanted something colder. Preparation, concentrated artillery, limited attacks, reserves, repeated pressure, attrition. A battle that would consume men, ammunition, tanks, and fuel until one side could no longer replace what was disappearing. And if one commander cannot replace what he loses, which kind of battle should his opponent force him to fight? That is where the ledger begins to change meaning. Supply shortage was not created by Montgomery, but prolonged pressure could make that shortage more painful. Numerical superiority was not created by Montgomery, but reserves allowed him to absorb losses that Rommel could not. British artillery superiority was not created by Montgomery, but guns still had to be concentrated, supplied, and incorporated into an operational plan. Rommel's fuel shortage was not created by Montgomery, but every forced reaction and every armored counterattack consumed mobility that could not easily be restored. The same facts that seem to remove credit from Montgomery can now be examined from another direction. Conditions become weapons only when a command system uses them. The offensive began on the night of the 23rd of October with enormous artillery preparation. Infantry and engineers moved into the minefields during Operation Lightfoot. The original breakthrough did not work cleanly. British armour became congested. Axis anti-tank weapons inflicted serious losses. The battle did not simply collapse beneath the weight of British numbers. Montgomery had to revise the plan. The fighting entered the attritional phase he called crumbling. Limited attacks, pressure on Axis positions, and attempts to wear down reserves rather than gamble everything on one sweeping maneuver. He later paused, regrouped, and launched Operation Supercharge. The breakthrough came on the 4th of November, and here the strange relationship between Rommel and Montgomery becomes clearer. In the posthumously edited Rommel papers, Rommel's retrospective explanation of Alamein heavily emphasized British material superiority, air power, and Axis logistical weakness. He argued that British methods were made possible by overwhelming superiority and continued to criticize British command as slow and excessively cautious. If that is where the analysis stops, Montgomery almost disappears. Fuel defeated Rommel, aircraft defeated Rommel, ships defeated Rommel, factories defeated Rommel, numbers defeated Rommel. Montgomery merely happened to be standing on the winning side. But Rommel's own later assessment is more interesting than that. He acknowledged that Montgomery calculated carefully, adapted his method to the realities of the Alamein front, and although Rommel considered him excessively cautious, could afford that caution because of the strength available to him. He even credited Montgomery with major strategic achievements. And that may be the real meaning behind why Rommel could never give Montgomery full credit. Not because he secretly hated him, not because jealousy can be proved, not because Rommel believed Montgomery was incompetent. The historical record does not require any of those claims. It is because Rommel's explanation of the battle contained a natural ceiling on personal credit. If the defeat is explained by fuel plus supply plus air superiority plus numerical superiority plus strategic disadvantage, then no enemy commander can receive all the credit, nor should he. But one question remains after every one of those boxes has been ticked. Who made sure Rommel had to fight the battle those disadvantages made hardest for him to survive? That is where Montgomery belongs in the ledger. Not as the creator of British superiority, as the commander responsible for converting much of that superiority into battlefield pressure. And there is another problem with removing him entirely. Rommel's reputation depends upon presenting him as an exceptionally dangerous opponent, a commander capable of improvisation, a commander who had repeatedly embarrassed British forces, a commander who could exploit hesitation with frightening speed. But if Rommel's victories demonstrate his brilliance, while every defeat is explained entirely by fuel, supplies, Hitler, numbers, or bad luck, his reputation becomes almost impossible to test. Nobody can ever truly defeat him. Victory proves his ability. Defeat proves only his circumstances. That is not serious military history. The fairer interpretation allows two truths to survive at the same time. Rommel entered the decisive battle under profound disadvantages, and Montgomery still deserves credit for helping make those disadvantages decisive. Return one last time to the ledger. Supply, yes. Fuel, yes. Numerical disadvantage, yes. Allied air and material power, yes. Strategic pressure, yes. And finally, Montgomery, also yes. Do not erase the other entries. That would miss the entire point. Montgomery did not make El Alamein impressive by pretending the battle was equal. It was not equal. His achievement was partly that he refused to fight as though it were. He accumulated strength, resisted pressure to move before he was ready. avoided giving Rommel the fluid battle he preferred, and then forced an attritional contest against an army far less able to replace what it lost. That does not prove Montgomery was the greater general. It does not need to. The fairest explanation of El Alamein may be the one neither legend particularly likes. Rommel had real reasons for losing, and Montgomery still deserved real credit for beating him. If you watched until the end, write Ledger in the comments. And subscribe for more stories where the reputation of a famous commander is tested against the battle he actually had to fight.